This week on Just Solutions, the Doomsday Clock is at 100 seconds to midnight. A project of the Bulletin of atomic scientists, the clock is a symbol of the threats facing humanity and the planet, from nuclear war to the climate crisis. It's the closest to catastrophe than at any other time in its 75-year history. This year's time setting recognises the additional threats of the ongoing COVID pandemic and the rise of disinformation. This week's guest is Sharon Squassoni, co-chair of the Bulletin's Science and Security Board. The organisation is calling for action and outlines practical steps to move us away from catastrophe and toward a safer world. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Sharon, it's great to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us. As the name of the clock and the project itself suggests, this really is something we need to pay attention to, the Doomsday Clock. And we are inching ever closer, it seems, to catastrophe for the planet and for humanity. And in fact, you're quoted when the latest time setting was released at saying, we're stuck in a perilous moment, one that brings neither stability nor security. So we haven't moved back on the clock. We've been at 100 seconds to midnight for the last couple of years. And so what are the four main issues that have brought us to remain at 100 seconds to midnight in the Doomsday Clock?
So let me just back up a second and talk a little bit about the history of the clock. So the clock was actually started or became an icon on the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1947. And at that time, it was mostly focused on nuclear weapons because that was the biggest existential crisis that we faced. Our Science and Security Board, which now sets the clock, looks at more than nuclear weapons because, frankly, climate change poses an existential risk to us. So we began folding in climate change, but we're more than a decade ago. But we also look at other kinds of threats. So biosecurity, disruptive technologies. One thing we highlighted a few years ago was the impact of a corrupted information ecosphere, you can call it, on our ability to govern. You know, when we no longer, and I think the COVID pandemic highlighted this for us, when people don't know what's truth and what's fiction, what's accurate information and what's disinformation, it makes it harder to agree on solutions. It makes it harder to go forward. So I would say, you know, nuclear weapons have a very fast impact on our existence. Climate change has a longer time scale, but we're also looking at, you know, bioweapons, biosecurity, disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence. It's a real range of technologies.
Well, as you mentioned there, that you identified those disruptive technologies and that threat of misinformation and its threat to governance, that was several years ago. We're living through the very reality of that, whether it's misinformation around what's happening with COVID or vaccines, and of course, what's happening with elections and the future of our democracy, essentially, and its connection to the disinformation here. So this is something that the Bulletin identified a while ago. We're living through those very realities right now.
We are, and the problem is, you know, the technology that makes this conversation possible and makes it possible to reach so many people can also be used for bad purposes. I mean, the same with nuclear energy, right? It can be used to create electricity, and it can also be used to create, you know, unbelievable devastation in the form of nuclear weapons. I think, you know, for the Bulletin, we look at, I mean, our basic ground rule is, you know, if we created the technologies, we should be able to use technology to our advantage to solve some of those problems. And that's a theme, I think, that runs through most of our discussions and our proposals. On disinformation, it's very, very tricky, right? Because a lot of that sphere is private. We've seen some of the big um, um, private companies very loath to restrict things. And there are also, of course, ethical issues with that, and restriction of freedom of speech and other things. So you're exactly right. We are right in the middle of that, and there are not a lot of actionable solutions at hand at the moment.
Well, the Doomsday Clock itself, it's a symbol, and it's a very potent symbol to show us how close we are to catastrophe. It is 75 years old now. And so when it was created, the world was a very different place. And as you said, the impetus around the creation of the clock came from what was happening with the Cold War, with nuclear weaponry. And I do think that many people feel that nuclear weaponry is part of our history, is part of the Cold War. And there's not necessarily an understanding of how that continues to be a threat, the money that's being spent, and the continued threat that it plays. And so put that into some context for us right now. What are the main states that have nuclear weapons? And then we'll talk a little bit about the treaties and what's happening right now.
Sure. So what your readers or listeners need to know is that the two largest nuclear weapon states have been, at the forefront. That's the United States and what was then the Soviet Union, now Russia, right? We have about 95% of the nuclear weapons on the planet. There are between 13 and 14,000 nuclear weapons worldwide. Most of these are much, much larger than the ones that the US detonated over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are 9 total nuclear weapon states. So it's the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK, all of which are members of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. And so these are what we call the traditional, permanent 5. They're also members of the UN Security Council, the Permanent Council. And then there are states that are outside of the regime. And so those are India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. The history, we think of the Cold War as being a time when we were on hair trigger alert, and actually, some of the history is really fascinating and very, very scary. There was a time when the US had its bombers on airborne alert constantly, 24/7, and, not really considering that some of these planes might crash with potentially bad consequences. The threat during the Cold War was considered so high, right, that the US and the Soviet Union could, launch attacks out of the blue. That threat is gone, even though for most of us, this tension in Ukraine feels very, very uncomfortable. But the problem is you now have more nuclear weapon states. You have states like North Korea, which has no problem rattling that nuclear saber anytime it wants attention. We don't know what their intentions are, what they're going to be doing with their nuclear weapons. And so when you have more players in the game, the kinds of calculations that you make about ensuring that nuclear weapons aren't used get much, much more complicated.
What are the current treaties that are in place around nuclear weapons? Because I know that the 5 permanent member states of the UN Security Council that you mentioned there are treaties that govern some of this. What are some of the ones that are currently in place?
So the landmark treaty is the 1970 Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, right? So those 5 states that we just talked about are members of that treaty. And underneath this treaty, they actually agree eventually to get rid of their nuclear weapons. It's in Article 6 of the treaty. And in exchange for that, the other members of the treaty agreed not to acquire nuclear weapons, right? And so this treaty is nearly universal. There are only a handful of countries not in it. And this is what has kept actually the problem of nuclear weapons from spreading much further. But that treaty isn't enough, right? Because it doesn't have specific steps that countries are supposed to follow to eventually get rid of their nuclear weapons. And so what grew up over time were several treaties between the US and the then Soviet Union, now Russia, to reduce numbers of nuclear weapons. The one treaty that is currently in force is called the New START Treaty. And that, apologies for my dog, doesn't like that treaty. No. That treaty limits our strategic nuclear weapons to a relatively small number, right? 1,750 deployed strategic weapons. That treaty was just extended last year, and that's a really good thing. It was extended for 5 years because it puts a cap on the number of weapons that at least the US and Russia have. There are no other countries that have actually negotiated limits on their nuclear weapons. And that is part of the problem. You see now China is building a lot of missile silos. We think they are planning to ramp up their nuclear weapons to achieve some kind of parity with the United States. Right now, they have about 300 nuclear weapons, whereas the US has more than 4,000 all told in its arsenal. There are other treaties that we have, multilateral treaties that have been signed to kind of try and contain the nuclear arms race. There are a couple that ban nuclear testing, not entirely, that have been in effect a long time. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would ban all nuclear tests, including underground testing, that has been in limbo for 20 years. It has not entered into effect, although most, exception of North Korea, most countries with nuclear weapons have not tested in a long time. And then one final treaty is called the so-called Ban Treaty, the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, which was negotiated. It entered into force a couple of years ago. The problem is all the countries with nuclear weapons don't like that treaty and didn't engage in negotiating it. So the question of its eventual impact is really up in the air.
I mean, I think everything that you've just outlined there underpins the paradox behind nuclear weaponry in and of itself, and the fact that we have member states, who are members of these treaties, who say they're not going to expand their arsenal, and yet that's exactly what they're doing. They are expanding their arsenal. So those treaties essentially would seem to be void. But there is a paradox at the heart of the nuclear arms race. In fact, the 1985 Reagan-Gorbachev statement, from the heart of the Cold War said, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And yet we have these countries that are investing billions and billions of dollars into these weapons and these arsenals that can never be deployed. And if they are deployed, well, that's the point of this whole conversation. We're 100 seconds to midnight in terms of full catastrophe for the human race. So talk a little bit about the paradox that underpins everything to do with nuclear war.
Right. It is very paradoxical. And that's why in some ways it's very hard for average people to understand, right? First of all, there's a tremendous amount of secrecy around nuclear weapons, right? They're the crown jewels in the security system. We need a whole lot of them, but we hope we're never going to use them. The more weapons we have, during the Cold War, the idea was if we could assure the destruction of our opponent, the Soviet Union, then at one time, can you imagine, we had 30,000 nuclear weapons. Really enough to obliterate the planet. But if we had all those weapons, we could make sure that they were held, that they would just be decimated. Okay, then they would never fire at us first. So it's kind of crazy from someone who comes from the outside to think, okay, these weapons, they're so destructive, but they do ensure our security. How does that work? One of the reasons why the clock is at 100 seconds to midnight, one of the reasons is that all of the states now with nuclear weapons are engaged in modernizing their arsenals. And the US is set to spend more than $1 trillion over the next, few decades to upgrade the warheads, the platforms, specific missile systems, our submarines, our bombers, everything. And for someone sitting on the outside in like in a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, they're looking at this saying, okay, you're going to invest that much money and we'll be lucky if you don't use them. But like, you really have no intention of giving these up if you're going to spend that much money. There's kind of a, it's not just a question of investment, but also, the time and attention and the bureaucratic infrastructure and everything else. If you continue to highlight this as the key to the continued existence of your country, then it seems that those promises of eventual disarmament are quite hollow, and it's not wrong. I mean, so the real question, to go back to your point about Reagan and Gorbachev, Reagan was a hawk, right? He used language about the evil empire. He was quite hawkish about the Soviet Union, and yet somehow he was able to sign agreements with Gorbachev, the landmark Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement, which got rid of it's the only treaty of its kind, got rid of an entire class of missiles that threatened Europe, not just nuclear, but also conventional. That was a tremendous contribution to world peace. The problem now is that treaty is defunct. The U.S., after it was signed in 1987, and last year, the year before, I can't remember the date exactly, or went back a few years, where the U.S. said, well, Russia, we don't think you're complying with this treaty anymore. We have some compliance issues, verification issues. And eventually, President Trump pulled us out of that treaty. And so now, Russia, it's quite possible, will deploy new ground-launched intermediate nuclear weapons that will threaten Europe, which will also make any kind of future Ukrainian situation, if it arises, much more tense, much more complicated, much more dangerous.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching. Let us know your thoughts on this. Have you been following the Doomsday Clock over the years? And what are your thoughts about this latest setting, 100 seconds to midnight? But Sharon, in addition to the threat of a nuclear war, of course, the climate crisis is this massive threat to humanity itself. And the fact that the timing has not improved on the Doomsday Clock, even though we've just come out of a major global conference, the COP26 that happened in Glasgow, shows that maybe there is not a lot of progress that is being made internationally when it comes to the climate crisis. Why did things not improve when it comes to the Doomsday Clock, despite, it seems, broader acknowledgement that we are now in a crisis? It's no longer being discussed as climate change, but a climate crisis. What are your thoughts, or what are the thoughts of the Bulletin when it comes to the climate crisis?
Right. So we did highlight in our statement, the fact that there were positive developments, both in nuclear weapons and climate change and elsewhere, but they weren't enough really to dramatically affect these longer term trends. So in climate, you have very long term trends. And, the fact of the matter is we have to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. I mean, until we get to that net zero place, the amount of CO2 and other greenhouse gases is just continues to build up. And what we're seeing now are these really dramatic, disastrous, and horrible climate. I don't want to call them incidents, but we're seeing the effects of that. And so, it's terrific that the U.S. rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement. It was terrific. We went to Glasgow. Countries are saying the right things, but the question is whether they're are they putting their money where their mouth is, right? Are the policies and the investment programs really geared towards moving toward net zero? And even, the aspirational goals there are some climate experts who say, it's not enough. It's not quickly enough. We need to kind of dramatically make changes. So, for example, most countries have suffered tremendously during COVID-19, right? And so there are investment programs, there are ways that governments are trying to, build back their economies. How green are those programs? How do we have a very clear focus that all the development that we're going to do, all the development money is going to go towards green projects? It's time to do that. And I think, Greta Thunberg and there have been quite a few, as you just showed, youth protests about this, because they're saying, it's not just words anymore. It's really, really, we have to make those actions count.
Well, in addition to highlighting all of these threats, the Doomsday Clock is also a way to highlight what needs to happen and what can happen to actually turn the clock back. In fact, there's a hashtag turn back the clock, and there are a lot of resources on the Bulletin's website, thebulletin.org. You can take a virtual tour on how to turn back the clock. So what does need to happen internationally, nationally? Well, these are global issues, really. So what needs to happen to turn back the clock so we're not either advancing even closer to midnight or even staying where we are, because we are at as you said, a perilous position right now?
Well, it's a tall order. We had in our statement that our Science and Security Board released, we had several ideas that are kind of illustrative of the things that you would need to do, but it's not the full enchilada. And so part of the social media campaign is designed to, get additional ideas. So for example, on nuclear weapons, we are and we have been for a long time, quite concerned with the fact that nuclear war could happen as a result of an accidental launch, or that there are not enough steps in the process of authorizing the use of nuclear weapons to kind of lengthen the decision-making process. So we came up, we brought up the fact that last year during the January 6th insurrection, that some of the protesters actually got quite close to Vice President Pence, who carries the backup nuclear football, right? There were, for the first time in 30 years or so, the Senate a couple years ago held a hearing about, well, actually, who does have, does the president have sole authority to issue a nuclear strike? These were things that, we were kind of quite confident about, that we know how it's done, and, it's never going to happen accidentally. But so one of the recommendations we made was that President Biden should eliminate a U.S. president's sole authority to launch nuclear weapons. So in other words, build a process that has a few more voices into it, which we should have in a democracy, right? But not only should we do that, we should work with other countries to also, make that, build the barriers up a little bit against nuclear use. I'm sure Vladimir Putin's comments about nuclear weapons don't make anybody sleep better at night. I think we need a little more cooperation there. On modernization programs, there was a suggestion by a group of 50 Nobel laureates that all countries donate 2% of their military expenditures, or cut back 2% and donate 1% of that to combat or to alleviate poverty, to combat climate change, those kinds of things. So move the money from defense, move it to climate mitigation, greening the energy sectors, transportation sectors. So there's a really long list. Some of the, I'll just mention maybe two more on in the biosphere, that both national leaders and international organizations need to devise more effective regimes for monitoring biological research and development. One of the potential problems that the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted is that some of the research in laboratories, and especially I think we had something like 59 high security level biological labs, there are no international restrictions on those, right? It's kind of an honor system, how you implement things. I mean, we have a treaty, Biological Weapons and Toxins Convention, that prohibits biological weapons, but there's no verification associated with that. So I think, the more that countries can collaborate, either under the World Health Organization or other international organizations, to try and get a handle on some of this biological research, is it going in the right direction? Is it being done in a safe and secure manner? The more we can reduce some of those risks. In the information sphere, that's really, I think you highlighted earlier in the program, that's really an area where we need to put our heads together and figure out whether there are some kinds of international standards that we can put together. And that would really be kind of a range. Everybody has to get involved, governments and tech firms and experts and media organizations, especially, to see if we can put up some protocols or ways that we can combat some of the internet-enabled misinformation.
Well, as I said, there is a lot of information and resources at the website, thebulletin.org. People can read the full statement on this year's Doomsday Clock setting 100 seconds to midnight, but also the plans, as you touched on there, Sharon, outlining some of the things that can be done to help move the clock back. But in the meantime, Sharon Squassoni, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for having this discussion.
Well, join us next week, same time, same place, for another show. But you don't even have to wait that long, because you can watch past episodes at our website, freespeech.org, and subscribe to the podcast so you can listen to the show anytime. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. But do join us again next week, same time, same place, for Free Speech TV's Just Solutions.